I was asked to talk about debt and the future of democracy. I didn't actually make up the title, but it could work. And it ties together two threads of things which I had been thinking about for a long time and actually spent a lot of my time trying to keep apart. You know, I thought the Occupy movement was about creating new forms of direct democracy, and the debt book was completely different. I actually was pretty determined not to impose my ideas about debt on the movement because it seemed obnoxious to try to become the intellectual vanguard and sort of impose my ideas as the ideology of a social movement. It also seemed obnoxious to use a social movement to sell a book. So, you know, I kept not bringing up debt in Occupy meetings. The things kept converging, and I spent a lot of time wondering why. I think it has something to do with changes in the nature of American capitalism. I'm throwing away my notes here. I thought I was going to organize this in a totally different way. When we first decided to have an occupation in Zuccotti Park, we really weren't sure who was going to show up. There had been previous attempts to actually have occupations even in Zuccotti Park, where about 5 people showed up. But this time there were a lot. And we quickly tried to assess who they were and why they were there. And overwhelmingly, the people that we talked to talked about debt issues. They were mostly students or recent graduates. They all had kind of the same story. They said, well, you know, we were the good kids. We were people who they mostly came from modest backgrounds. They were smart, they studied hard, they worked hard, they got into college, they took out the loans because that's what you have to do in America. They did everything they were supposed to do. They graduate, and the economy collapses because this bunch of bankers, you know, didn't play by the rules at all. Yet the bankers who lied and cheated and destroyed the world economy, they get bailed out by the government. Meanwhile, these students are stuck with $30,000, $40,000 in debt. They're going to be treated like they're deadbeats, like they did something wrong for the rest of their lives, and you know, because they owe money to the bankers, who are the very people who didn't act like that. So there was a profound feeling of injustice, and that sort of feeling of outrage, like, you know, why are you telling me that I'm a failure? Even though it came out that that was the big issue people were organizing around, we got enormous support from organized labor. And this is really interesting because traditionally this had not been the case. The plight of the indebted college graduate is not the sort of thing which 30 years, 40 years ago would have profoundly moved the heart of the average bus driver in New York City. But now it did. After the economic crash, you see this massive deleveraging. Everybody who could possibly get out of debt did. Credit card debt fell very precipitously. In the same way you saw mortgages being paid off. Everybody was trying to get out of debt. There are 2 classes of people who really couldn't. One were people with student loan debt. Student loans went up because you just can't get out of student loan debt. It's impossible. Legislation is incredibly punitive. And the other were the working poor, the sort of people who have subprime mortgages. So suddenly there was a newfound alliance. I mean, the American political system is essentially a system of institutionalized bribery. When we were talking about the 99% and the 1%, that was what we were really getting at. It's not just a notion of social class, which of course is something you couldn't talk about at all in America until just recently. It's also a notion of class power. The 1% are not only the people who've gained all of the economic profits from growth and productivity over the last 30 years or so, they're also the people who make all the campaign contributions. Something like 98% of campaign contributions come from 1% of the population. So essentially, they're not just the people who have wealth or manage to harvest the profits, they're the people who've managed to take their wealth, turn it into political power, and turn that political power into the means to accumulate more wealth. So the power of the government and the state power and financial power slowly come to seem almost indistinguishable to most people. You know, where you have coins, it's usually where soldiers are operating. Coinage is, in fact, a military technology. Since we're talking about democracy here, it might be interesting to think about the origins of the term. I did some research on attitudes toward democracy on the part of the in the early republic, people who actually wrote the American Constitution. And it's quite remarkable. It's pretty much uniform, unanimous opinion on the part of all the people who came up with the American constitutional system that democracy was bad. They were all against it. None of them thought of themselves as creating a democracy. They opposed it radically. So the whole system of checks and balances is actually created explicitly to prevent democracy. Emanuel Wallerstein, many years ago, suggested that a revolution is not what we think it is. In fact, all revolutions are world revolutions. Sometimes they happen in one country, like the French Revolution. Sometimes they don't, like 1848. It happens all over the world, doesn't see state power anywhere. But the world changes. Again, 1917 seems to happen in one country, but really it happens everywhere. And then 1968, it's more like 1848. Wallerstein's great point, and it stayed with me ever since I read it. I think it's really impressive. He said, well, you know, the revolution has happened when ideas that were considered insane in one generation are things that everybody has to at least pay lip service to in the next. That's how you know there's been a world revolution. There's a change of political common sense. And I think that that's quite possibly what's happening now, and why you can talk about a world revolution, starting with the Arab Spring, sweeping through southern Europe, and eventually ending up in the United States and elsewhere. A democratic movement now is a movement which is horizontally organized, bottom-up, decentralized, based on principles of direct democracy, autonomous direct action. We might well be at a juncture where our very basic principles of what politics is actually about and what the shape of democratic politics might look like are actually undergoing a profound transformation, which the end result we can't at this point possibly know. Actually, I asked Wallerstein in 2011, okay, so are we talking about the world revolution of 2011 yet? And he said, yeah. If you look at the Tea Party, the biggest difference between the Tea Party and Occupy was age. The average age of a Tea Party person was about 45, and the average age of an Occupy person is about 25. So, you know, we have a group of people who see themselves as the last bastion of the creditor generation, and young people are growing up with nothing but debt, and they have essentially contrasting interests here. Everybody's arguing as if the US debt is a big problem. It's not clear what the problem is supposed to be. And it's all based on this notion that money is sort of like petroleum or something. There's only so much. Somehow it just happens, and then you just need to get it. And of course, this isn't the case at all. And, you know, in fact, American money is circulating government debt, as I say, specifically war debt. And it's not like the Republicans aren't aware of that. You know, first of all, as Dick Cheney famously remarked when the Republicans were running things, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. Yeah. You know, they knew perfectly well that debt doesn't matter. And in fact, in contrast, when Bill Clinton actually balanced the budget back in the 90s, Alan Greenspan, the ultra-Anrandian Republican, he freaked out. I am advocating some kind of broad jubilee, and I should emphasize to begin with that, you know, this is something that's happened over and over again in world history. It's happened quite recently in some places. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait did it, you know. That was their way of fending off the Arab Spring. So it can be done in conservative, regressive ways, but it can also be done, generally speaking, when large revolutions do occur in world history. You know, debt cancellation is a part of the package. The big question is not whether this is going to happen, because I find that when you talk to more realistic people in the governing classes, usually they'll admit to you that of course it's going to happen. I mean, some mass debt cancellation, how much is up for grabs. You know, this is already happening to some degree. Well, it did happen in 2008, right? I mean, they don't want to tell you this, but like, by some accounts, trillions of dollars, $3 trillion, I think it was, worth of debt was canceled when they had to save American Insurance Group, and, you know, institutions like that. So I think the real struggle is over how it's going to happen. Is it going to be come from below? Is it a demand of popular movements? Is it going to be seen as a gift or presented as a gift from above? Are they going to admit they're doing it? Or are they going to pretend they're doing something else, as they did with the 2008 bailouts? And finally, is it going to be used as a way of preserving existing structures of power and inequality in more or less the same form, or is it going to be used as an opportunity to rethink some basic things about the way our societies work? I kind of had a hunch about this one, that there's been this process almost of Sovietization of capitalism. You know, we all think of the Soviet Union as being this ridiculously inefficient economy because they had this ideology of full employment, so they had to make up all these jobs that didn't actually do anything. Yet, then you look around and you just meet people all the time. You ask them what they do, and they're kind of embarrassed and don't want to talk about it. And if you press them, they'll be like, oh, you know, I'm a human resource consultant. I mostly do. I mostly just go to meetings and. What does that do to our sense of ourselves? How can you have dignity in labor if you go there and you secretly feel that your job shouldn't actually exist? I've never met a corporate lawyer who would not, if you press them, admit that they're not really doing anything that contributes in any positive way to society. I mean, it's one of the big debates that we've had is, all right, like say we have a generalized debt cancellation to move to a new mode of more sustainable economy, whatever that might be. Where shall the priority go to, like, eliminating working hours or some kind of form of basic income? Should we go to a 4-hour day as our big emphasis, or would basic income do the same thing? I mean, you might say that like the basic income could well solve the bullshit job problem, if anything could, because a lot of people in these meaningless jobs, they'll say like, I hate myself, I go to work every day and I don't do anything, but I have to do this for my children. If those people were just paid to do whatever they liked, probably most of them would come up with something of actual more social value than what they're being paid to do. I'm convinced of this, I mean, society would be the better for it. I think that's what the basic premise of basic income is, that, leave people to their own devices. Okay, a few people will just be useless and lazy, but most people want to do something, and some people are going to come up with something that you would never think to pay them to do, which will be much better. At this point, if you want to be democratic, you have to operate outside the state, because the state has been almost entirely co-opted by these top-down coercive structures, which are not answering to anything resembling the people, the multitude, or whatever you want to call them. An anarchist system of organization is simply one which would not require anybody to be able to call somebody up with a gun to say, at any point, to say, shut up and do what you're told. And I think that once we actually have the opportunity to start experimenting with that, we'll be surprised by how many possibilities there really are.
Your movement, that which you represent. Are you really the 99%?
Yeah.